Real quick, before Harold starts us off, Brian, stay standing up. Today is Brian's 14th AA birthday, everybody.
Way to go, Brian. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Harold. I'm an alcoholic.
Harold.
And thank you again for inviting us to come and kick off our session time. If there's a theme for this morning, it would just be our old ideas, kind of a carry forward from last night into what we're doing this morning, and segue all the way through our time together. I just want to thank you first for the gift. The camel was pretty awesome. I don't know the story behind those, or those are handmade, or what those are, but whoever, I'd love to know the story, the backstory. And then my wife sends her gratitude for the flowers because she got blessed with those, and they showed up, and she was pretty stoked about that. And so that was good. That was brownie points, boys. You really did yourself well. But I wanted to start us off, and I'll just kick it to John after about 30 minutes, and he'll finish us out for the session. I'm going to just start us out with just a little bit of a guided reflection, just to kind of center ourselves and to think about this session, but just think about our time together this weekend, why we really come here. Fellowship and camaraderie, brotherhood, all those things are so important. And making new friends, enriching other relationships that we already have are so imperative. But I think it's important to just kind of just try to humble ourselves, because a lot of you guys have been sober a long time. I mean, and it's easy to get complacent. It's easy to get stale. It's easy to think you're doing all right because you got time. You got all this time, and it's. I think spaces like this create a space where we can just unplug from all that and really try to be real with each other. I know that's what John and I will try to do. And all we have to share is what we've seen, what we've heard, what we've experienced. So we do that. So I just wanted to just invite you just to settle yourself. I just want to read a little bit of a guided reflection as we go into this morning, just some thoughts I had about our time together. So let's just take a moment to settle in with that. And just meditate on the idea that you don't need to fix anything right now. And you don't need to perform, and you don't need to have all the right answers. Just sit where you are, feet on the floor or whatever, and just breathe normally. Notice that you made it here, and that matters. We had to send one of our brothers home because of just some injuries and just illness. And so we want to lift up Carl this morning, who's had to be taken home last night, and we just pray for his well-being. This weekend isn't asking how long you've been sober. It's asking, how are you actually doing? So gently, without judgment, bring your attention to your own life. Not the version other people see, not the version you talk about, just the real one. Notice what feels solid, and notice what feels strained. Notice where things flow and where you feel tired, stuck, or disconnected. No need to dramatize it, and no need to minimize it. Just notice. You may notice areas that look fine on the outside, but they feel really thin on the inside. And you may notice places where you've been managing instead of living. If discomfort shows up, tightness, resistance, that's not failure. That's honesty trying to surface. This room is not here to take anything from you. It's here to make space for truth. So hold the question quietly as we begin. Where might my life be asking for a different kind of help? And I bring us back to that. In this first session, we're going to talk about our old ideas and just talking about the difference between manageability, unmanageability in our life prior to getting here, as we're here, and wherever you're at on your spiritual journey as it relates to time. There's a great question in the book that really centers on this. It comes off page 61. And I just have all my stuff right here in front of me instead of bringing all the books and all that. It just keeps it simple for me. But here's the question. This is on page 61. Here's the question. Is he not a victim of the delusion that he can wrest satisfaction and happiness out of this world if he only manages it well. And you just take the word rest right off the bat, rest, satisfaction. It already sounds exhausting, just trying to do that. But just thinking about that question contextually, where you're at today, right now, in the stream of things. I know in the room we have lots of Packer fans, we have Bear fans, we have Brewers fans, we have Cubs fans. I'm a Kansas City Chiefs guy, and so I sit here with a little disappointment, but a lot of confidence. My friend John is a Washington Commanders guy, but he doesn't like the name change, so he won't say it. It's his own denial that he hangs in there with, right? That he hangs on to.
Hanging on.
He's hanging on. But you look at the unmanageability of that, because you get Bears fans. Listen to it. I've watched some of these exchanges go on. You get Bears fans and Packers fans going back and forth. Nothing gets settled, and right? Nothing gets settled. We just have a lot of energy. We throw it at each other, and then at the end of it, we shake hands and go our own way. But do you think about the unmanageability, just even with sports, football especially, this delusional mind that, that when you scream at the TV, you scream at these players, you scream at these coaches, you scream at the refs. We do it. All of us do it that are sports fans. And it's just a demonstration of what unmanageability actually looks like, because none of us is controlling anything, at all. At the end of the day, we're just Monday, we're just couch coaches. We're Monday quarterback, referees and all those types of things that we do trying to manage the game. If the guy would have just ran, if the guy would catch a stupid ball, if the guy would learn how to throw the ball. We say all these things like we're actually delusionally managing the game, but we're not, and it's so funny to watch it in yourself. But that's what unmanageability looks like in our own lives. And I shared with you last night, how I got to this space when I showed up at Roy's house. And Roy passed away this last fall. He's my first sponsor. He would have died. If he would have lived one more year, he would have had 50 years of sobriety. But I was privileged enough to officiate his funeral, and it was a powerful experience. It was a real joy to sit and be able to do that for Roy and his family, and lots of people in recovery that came for that. But I think about just how unmanageable my life was when I encountered that guy. But I can also look at how manageable life is still today at times. And so that's really, these old ideas sometimes are not such old ideas as it relates to us trying to control our life and being, running the whole show, and still under this delusion that we can wrest satisfaction on this world, out of the people, places, and circumstances in our life if we just manage it well. And I think we all fall prey to that. But I told you last night when I came in, I had trials to attend to. And so that I came in, and actually I got sober before April 7th, 1987. My sobriety date's really probably sometime in February. That's when I came home from St. Louis. But I didn't go to AA right away, as I told you last night. And when I finally did start going to AA, I went to this little clubhouse there in St. Louis called Hampton Facility. And there was some old facility cripple that had been there forever, Denny. And Denny Thomas was his name. He's long passed away. But Denny, he had a failed suicide attempt, with a gunshot to his head. So he had a huge indentation in his skull, and you could tell that, that he'd suffered pretty dearly with that shot to his head. But he was funny, and he asked me one day when I was brand new, he said, "Hey, what's your sobriety date?" And I said, I looked at him, I said, "It's none of your business." That's what I told him. And because I didn't even know how to answer. And I go, "What's your sobriety date?" He goes, "My sobriety date's April 7th. I said, "I'm going to make that my sobriety date." He said, "You can't do that." I said, "I just did. I'm taking your sobriety date." And I stuck with it, not because I wasn't planning on being in AA. I wasn't planning on staying sober forever. And so I cheat myself out of a few months of sobriety. My buddy Jimmy from Jersey, he's got 9 more days than I do. He loves to make that point every time. I got 9 more days than you hear him, but he really doesn't, but he thinks he does. It's fun. It's fun. It's funny. But I'm saying that's how I came in here. And so my first trial, the trial I had to go to, was in June of 1987. And I went to court that day in Maplewood, Missouri, and it was storming out. Severe storms that day. And I sat down in the basement of this, where they had the courts, the city hall, all of it was one place. And I'm sitting down by the vending machines, and I'm waiting for my attorney to show up. And it's storming big time. And part of me wants to just get up and go, like I always said, just walk out of here, because it ain't going to end well for you. And my attorney comes in, and I said, "Hey, man, can I just sit right here? Do I have to go up there?" He goes, "You can sit here till I come and get you." He goes, just don't leave. I said, yeah, okay. Well, I mean, it's storming pretty bad. I didn't have a car, so I wasn't really going anywhere. So I sat there, and he went upstairs, and then it got really bad. I mean, like tornado bad. Warnings, sirens. It was insane. And it wasn't long. He come down the steps, and he's got a smile on his face. And I said, what are you smiling about? He goes, well, the good Lord's looking out for you. I said, why is that? He says, because you were the 8th person on the docket. And he said, everything's chaos up there with these storms. And so I was able just to walk over to the attorney and say, look, let's just get out of here. Here's what I want to do. And they reduced my 5th and 6th DWIs down to CNIs, still major violations. But it didn't cause a revocation of my parole, and I was able to walk out of it that day. You know, he goes, now you're not going to drive. You haven't. I didn't even ever have a legal driver's license ever up to that point. So he goes, you're not going to drive. Maybe, who knows when you'll ever get your license back. You're going to pay me a hell of a lot of money, but you're not going back. You know, and I said, thank God for that. You know, praise God. You know, and I walked out. But I mean, my life, you know, I got a break. I got some grace in my life. But I was still on step none. I had walked in AA and just, I told you that last night, how I carried myself. I did what I wanted, when I wanted, how I wanted, the way I wanted. If you didn't like it, too bad for you. That's how I flow. And so I showed up to AA like that. And I had a band. I had sober softball teams. I did all those things. And then I didn't get involved with any females right away. You know, that was suggested to me. They leave the girls alone. And but when you don't have a car and you don't have a license, you don't really have a job, you know, and you're robbing from Peter and writing bad checks to Paul, you don't really have a lot of girls out after you, you know, in those points, so you didn't have to really worry about it. But I finally did. I started chasing this girl, and she got pregnant right away. And after about 6 months of being pregnant, she just didn't want to be in recovery. She didn't want to do any of this stuff, and she left and tried to keep me out of her life. And that was a tough situation because I had nothing at the time, and I didn't know how to deal with that. And ultimately, she hooked up with a guy I think that she was with the whole time, which was a guy from her work. And I think she was hoping that was his kid, not mine, but it was mine. And so I filed a paternity suit against him, and that took years to unfold, a few years later. That girl was born on June the 6th, 1990. Her name's Megan. So that day, they filed a countersuit to adopt this child. They got married, and I took on that. I took that on, and I went to the courtroom, and by this time I'm married now. I got another child. I got my boss there. I got 30 people from AA there. I've never walked into a courtroom where I felt more confident anything in my life ever. And by this time, I'm over 3 years sober at this time. But I've just started working the steps, as I told you last night. Just started doing this deal. And things were starting to move in my life. And so that prosecutor brought me up on the stand. And I'll never forget it, man. He filleted me like a fish. He filleted me like a fish, man. And it was true, what he was laying out there. 100% true. And as much as I wanted to push back on that, but you want to talk about having the unmanageability of your life laid out in front of you with 30 people from AA, your mom, my boss was there. It was a very humbling situation. But the unfortunate piece of that is after the end of that judge said, you know, based on everything that's been, you know, presented here in this courtroom this week, during this trial, we're going to go ahead and grant the adoption, and we're going to remove Mr. Long from his rights. And basically, case dismissed. And it absolutely crushed me. It was the hardest sentence I ever got in my life. And there was no alcohol involved in it. There was no drugs involved in it. It was just purely old ideas of unmanageability and me living life on my terms that got me there. Page 62 of our book says, you know, were we under when we look back in our lives, we see where we made decisions based on self, which later put us in a position to be hurt. And this is one of those moments. I went home and crawled up like a little fetus on the couch and cried my eyes out. Couldn't believe this is happening to me. But that's what unmanageability looks like. And this delusion of the control that I'm really in control of what's going on. It's outrageous. But when you're caught in it, it can really, that's what it costs. So count the cost. And I got a real taste of what the root of the problem was in my life. And we'll talk more about that situation, you know, later today probably, or when we talk about the promises and steps 8 and 9. I'll share more about that particular piece, but I just want to lay that out there and be transparent. That's just how I started my journey in Alcoholics Anonymous, with unmanageability showing up big time in my life. And so sitting down with a sponsor at 3 years of sobriety and really turning back, pulling back the curtains, pulling back the blinds, peeling back the onions, really taking a hard look at your life was not easy to sit with Roy in those moments, because I'd never done it before in my life. And Roy was very sarcastic at times, very funny, but man, he was a great communicator of this program. And I remember sitting with Roy, he says, Harold, I'm going to tell you 3 things I know about an alcoholic. 1, they lie. 2, they lie. And 3, they lie about lying. And that's how we started our little journey towards the truth, and that's really what we're trying to get to, is the truth. What is the truth about me and what I'm really about? And so we had to walk through that and live through that in that space in time in our life, and walking through that. And what he made real clear, he goes, look, Harold, all people do this, but alcoholics are an extreme version of this, where no matter what, and this is for all of us, I don't care how long you've been sober, this is relative today, that no matter what's going on in our life, the temptation to want to fabricate or elaborate what's really happening in our life, we're masters at that. We've been doing that our whole lives. I mean, we're really, really good at it. He said it's kind of like the old man who was down at the riverbank fishing, and a little boy pulled up on a bicycle and goes, hey, mister, have you caught any fish today? And the old man looks at him and says, well, if I catch this one and one more, that'll give me 2 for the day. And the kid rides off and goes, man, that's awesome. Not realizing he just told him he hadn't caught anything, right? But he can't just tell him he hadn't caught anything. It's just too much of a leveling of pride to be able to get to that space. And we all struggle with that if we're real with each other. So when we pull the spotlight of truth back on ourselves and we look at the unmanageability in our life today as we sit here, there's that temptation really plays out, and we'll definitely hit on that probably in the 3rd session a lot. But it really shows up, pride, big time. And just self-obsession about ourselves, and just the self-focus and wanting to be judged by the way we sound, the way we look, what's going on in our life, and it's so dependent on that. It always reminds me, of a story about pride where a frog, it was the summertime, it was a drought, and a frog was stuck in this little body of water. It was about ready to be no water, and was going to end up shriveling up and dying in that pond. And a couple crows come down to get a drink out of the water, and the frog had this bright idea. He says, hey, crows, you can help me out. And they said, how can we help you out? And he says, I got to get out of here. I'm going to die here. He says, I have this idea. If you crows grab a stick with your feet, I can grab it with my mouth, and if you'll just take off, you can fly me to the next river or next body of water and just drop me there, and I can carry on. The crow's man, that's a genius. That's a genius. So they get the stick, and the frog grabs it with his mouth, and they take off. And they're flying not too high off the ground. They're flying to the next body of water, and they go over this driveway, and there's a couple of farmers standing there looking at them. They're looking up in the sky, and they couldn't believe what they were looking at. They could see. It was close enough they could see what was going on. And they could see the genius of it. And one of them says, well, I wonder who thought of that. And that frog goes, me! Right? And that's what happens to us, right, with this unmanageability, man. We've all had those moments in our life. And trying to get real and trying to be transparent. It sounds so easy. But it's so hard to do, and I think these sessions and spaces like this really, if we take advantage of it, is a real time to get real about our lives, no matter how blessed they may be, because we are super blessed, but we're still self-centered, and what we do know for sure is the idea of self will never be fully eradicated out of our life. Self's always going to show up somehow, some way in our life. It'll manifest itself, it'll show back up, it'll metastasize itself, and it can rear its ugly head time and time again. And the pride and the fear, as our book would clearly lay out, pride being the leads to procession, fear is the chief activator of all the other shortcomings and defects. These 2 things put together really can cripple us in a space, called Alcoholics Anonymous, and a spiritual journey we're on, even in a space like this right now where we're at. And I remember early on in my sobriety, I was with this psychotic girl, not realizing I was just as psychotic as she was, this early girl that was, she was a groupie of the band. She was an Italian girl. She was beautiful. And she was following us around, and I got involved with her. And this is when I'm on step none, and my life is complete chaos. I mean, everything about my life was chaos. But I remember going to a meeting, and one of my heroes in AA, he's passed away now, but his name is Lewis Trotter. Lewis was an African-American man, sober a long time when he died. Didn't have any education, but he worked at SLU Hospital, St. Louis University Hospital, in the maintenance and janitorial field, and he spent his whole career there. But Lewis was like B.B. King. That's what he looked like. It's what he sounded like when he was in the meetings. He had that voice, man, talk like that. And whenever he would talk, you would listen. And I got a whole book of Lewisisms, one-liners from Lewis. But this is one I'll never forget. Never heard it before, never heard it since. But I'm in a little meeting, I think it was on step 10 one night, but I just vomit this whole drama I got with this gal that I'm been chasing around. And all my buddies are on me about this. I don't have a sponsor. And I'm not listening to anything they say, and I'm pushing back. I'm being very resistant, and it's obvious to him and everybody else in the meeting. And Lewis was chairing the meeting, and so I finally stopped long enough to breathe. And he says to me, and I'll never forget it, sitting in a meeting, not even half this size. He says, "Well, Harold, looks like you got a problem with the crap sandwich." And he shuts up, and I'm like, okay, I never know what he's talking about. He goes, "Do you know what the crap sandwich is, Harold?" I said, "No, sir, I don't." He goes, "Well, I'm glad you asked." He said, "The pride's one piece of bread and the fear's the other. And you know what the problem with the crap sandwich is, Harold?" I said, "What's that, Lewis?" "You're the one eating it." Right. And I can promise you I've wiped a lot of brown stuff off my chin in my lifetime. And you might be wiping some off this weekend. That's my point. Is that pride and fear can really sandwich us big time in our walk here. And so learning how to get real in the beginning is such a chore. Wanting to look cleaner than we are, wanting to fabricate or elaborate what's really going on in our life. And you see this play out. I mean, if you fish, you see it when you fish. If you play golf, for sure. You play golf with, alcohol. I play golf with a lot of sober guys. You can get a judge of their character and their level of transparency real quick. When you're sitting there watching them, and you know damn well he got a 6 at least, and you're walking back and you're keeping score. What do you got? He goes, "I just put me down for a 5." It's like in your mind, you're like, dude, I know for sure you got at least. I know, or you seen them fluff the ball, or you seen them get the mulligan, they give themselves a mulligan or a free drop. Total compromise. And it's a 98 versus a 92 at the end of the day. Who cares? But the ego cares. The ego, wants to look a little cleaner, a little better than we are. That's what I mean. It's just everyday things, mundane things you see in your life. You see how this shows up. And I had so much junk. This unmanageability was so chaotic in my life. The narratives in my head had me convinced that I was a lot worse off than I was, that I was a lost cause in a lot of ways. So it's unfortunate. It's what keeps so many of us stuck in life. That's why we got a recidivism rate of 60, 70% in the penitentiary system. It's why people can go in and out of dozens of treatment centers in their lifetime, in detox, in residential, and then back out again because they've already given up before they get started. And this, I sat with that. There's an old parable about the devil had a yard sale one day. And he had all the 7 deadly sins on the table. He had them priced to sell. And there's a patron on the other side looking at all this, looking at lust, looking at anger, looking at greed, looking at sloth, seeing all this stuff. But on the back table, he had something behind him sitting on the table. And he asked Satan, he goes, "What is that?" He goes, "Don't worry about it. It's not for sale." He goes, "I'm curious, though. What is it?" He goes, "Don't worry about it. It's not for sale." And he just kept on and kept on. He goes, "I'll make you a hell of a deal." And all this other stuff. "Right now, I'll make you a hell of a deal. Package deal." He goes, "Yeah, but I just really want to know what that is." And he was so persistent. Finally, Satan says, "I'll tell you what it is, but it's not for sale." He goes, "What is it?" "It's discouragement." He goes, "Why isn't that for sale?" He goes, "Man, I win more souls over with that than all this other crap put together. It's not for sale." And when your soul, your mind, your will, and your emotions is how I would describe the soul, is full of discouragement, you quit before you ever get started. And that narrative had shaped my life, my entire life. And even though I sat there with 3 years of sobriety, of being, separated from alcohol and mind-altering substances in my life was completely unmanageable. It was right there in front of me for everybody to see. And so I sat there with Roy, and I'm thinking that I need deep psychological help. I'm like, I think I need, this is me self-evaluate, I think I need to go see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, or a therapist. And Roy's laughing. He goes, you don't need any of that. He goes, you know what you need? I said, what do I need? He goes, you need an assologist. And I said, a what? He goes, an assologist. I said, what is that? He goes, that is somebody who directs you through the school of assology. And I go, I don't know what any of that means. He goes, well, an assologist is somebody who will put their foot up your ass when you aren't doing what you need to be doing. And he goes, so just look at me. You can call me a sponsor because in reality, I'm an assologist. That's what you invited me to do, is put my foot up your ass. He goes, and this is some truth. He said, Harold, if you ever want to know the truth about who you are, what you are, watch your ass, because it'll never lie to you. The head of yours on your shoulders will lie to you all the time, but your ass will never lie to you. Your mouth and feet don't line up, but your ass will prove to what you're about and what you're doing. And it was a huge lesson for me to start judging myself by my actions instead of my intentions, because that's what we're gifted at. All human beings do it, but alcoholics are an extreme version of this. That we judge ourselves by our intentions, but we judge everybody else connected to us by their actions. And that shift, putting the spotlight of truth and really starting to look at my actions instead of my intentions, is a huge exercise, because that spotlight of truth seems to fade back out really quick, especially as you stay sober. And you start living off memories, instead of imagination. You're still judging yourself years into sobriety by your intentions instead of your actions. And you can fall into that. You're looking at the amount of time you've been here versus what the quality of your life is or what you're actually doing. And you can get lost in it. I've seen it happen to so many people. I mean, it's happened to me. So this unmanageability thing really comes into our life, and self comes back. And anytime it's new, it's fresh, it's exciting, but it isn't long. I just call it the new car smell. Before the new car smell wears off, and the next thing you know, I'm right back to doing what I've always done my whole life. You see this play out in our relationships, with our marriages, big time. So this is where we really could just take the topic of unmanageability. I don't care if you're sitting here with 50 years of sobriety and looking at your life, your marriage, your relationships, your kids, your grandkids, your job, your AA commitments, your service structure, whatever, and asking yourself honestly, what does it look like? What is the truth about that? Am I just getting by? Is there pieces of it that are compromised? But this is how self manifests itself. And it's always a checkpoint. I mean, at home is always the best measure. If you really want to know where you're unmanageable, where your life's kind of out of control, just ask the people that are closest to you. Ask your spouse to be transparent with you. Ask your kids to get real with you. Ask your closest brothers in AA, just get real with me for a minute. Where do you see that I'm slacking? Because there's always space. And it really at home is where I see so much of it, where self really shows up. Sometimes it's just not obvious. It's just a slow fade. I mean, that's how compromise and unmanageability does. It just shows up, and it just slows up quiet. It sits on the couch. It doesn't bother anybody. It's in the room. Next thing you know, you got this complacency. And you see it happen all the time in relationships. It's nothing to sit down with somebody who's been married 30, 40, 50 years, even 20 years, even 10 years, and saying, we haven't slept together in months, maybe years. We're really just more roommates than we are anything. We know how to live together. We know how to accommodate each other. I can finish her sentences, she can finish mine, but the intimacy has long been gone. I can remember a couple years ago who had 17 years together, and they were on the brink of divorce. They pushed it all in, and they went to see a particular person as a last result. I mean, they've been to marriage counseling, they've been to therapy, they've been to small group settings, they've invited other couples into their life, but they just couldn't break free from where they were at. And they went to see this particular gentleman, and they said, you were kind of our last stop on the block before we finalized this thing. We thought we'd just come and get real with you. And he says, ask him what's going on, and he just told him, that we're just 17 years, we're just ready to cash it in. And he says, will you both do an exercise for me? You're willing to do a quick exercise? And they said, yeah, we'll do it. And he said, I'm going to ask you to go into separate rooms. Put them in separate rooms. and he handed him, and this is a 3x5 index card. He just handed him a 3x5 index card to both of them and gave him a pencil and said, here's what he said to the guy. He says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to write down 5 things about your wife that she did in your early part of your relationship with her that really attracted you to her. Write those 5 things down. And he went into the woman and said the same thing. I want you to write 5 things down that he did that really attracted you to him. And that's it. Brought him back into the room, said, hand me your cards. And he's sitting there with both of them with their cards. He says, you both were given the same exercise. Let me read your responses to both of you. So I'll ask you, how many of those things do you think they were still doing? None. The very thing that brought them together, that attracted them to each other, they were done with it. They hadn't done those things for quite a while. So they just pulled away, they fell out of love, and it's just time for something new. And this is what unmanageability looks like in real life. Take booze out of it. Sober, long time, going to meetings, sponsoring guys. This is how unmanageability still shows up in our life. So the old ideas are really not that old sometimes. And so shining a spotlight of truth in our life and asking ourselves it's not if, it's where is it showing up? Where are some of these old ideas where I'm trying to control, where I'm trying to manage the outcomes of my life? Could be your money. Could be sitting here just, with more month left over than there is money, or you're stretched to the gill, or you're credited out, you're debted out. And the true reality is if you're not right with your money, well, you're not right spiritually, because it will affect everything you do. There's probably guys that aren't here this weekend because they could not afford to come. Seriously. It's just poor money management. And so unmanageability shows up everywhere. But those are some of the key places that it shows up. And if the unmanageability stays there long enough and the pain of irritable, restless discontent starts to set back in, it's not long before I start looking for relief, of some kind. Another credit card, or another female, or a girlfriend, or porn, or going down the line. And I'm looking for relief. So it's no longer a substance I'm putting in my life. It's behavior. Behavior is my sense of relief. And we all got that junk. So this old ideas and really thinking about, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives have become unmanageable. It still shows up today. And it's so easy to coast because we get into the groove. Meeting makers make it. I'm making my meetings, sponsoring some guys. You look really good. But then there's parts of it that are suffering. And we're not, because of pride and fear, because of those crap sandwiches, we're not really laying it out. And it's almost becomes a gentleman's agreement sometimes in recovery, even in a brotherhood like this one right here, where I call it the rule of 70-30, 60-40, 80-20, 90-10. But it could the percentage isn't what matters. It's the pride and fear behind it, because it's like just to use the 80-20 rule. It's just I could easily the gentleman's agreement is I'll tell you, John, about 80% of what's really going on. You tell me about 80% of what's going on with you. Don't ask me about my 20, my 10, my 30, my 40. I won't ask you about yours. It's almost an unsung written agreement that goes on. And you think about that in your own lives, in your own circles. Do people have the freedom to walk up and just be that transparent with you? Even your sponsor. Does your sponsor even get that real with you? I know you pray, I know you're going to, but let's just talk about, let's unpack what's really going on. So my sponsor, Steve, has Susie's phone number. He knows he can call Susie anytime he wants to call Susie. My wife knows she can call my sponsor anytime she wants to call my sponsor. He also knows most of the guys I'm sponsoring. He knows my inner circle very, very well. And he has say-so and the freedom to go. If he doesn't think there's full transparency going on in my life, he has the free reign to go do that. It's uncomfortable sometimes to know that, but at the same time, it's also very refreshing. There's many times my wife, throughout our marriage, has said many times, you know what, Harold, I feel like I'm about number 5 or 6 on your priority list. And in that, the other things above are wrong things or improper things. It's just the level of how selfish show back up in my life and where I got comfortable with, in certain things. And that's not even a 90% thing. She's 100% right most of the time when we do those things. So I'll wrap up with this and I'll pass it to John. One of the things that we implemented in our house we just call it the business meeting, and we have it once a month. No different than like a group conscience meeting in your home group. But it's just where everything's on the table. We look at our finances, we look at our investments, we look at our debts, we look at our kids, we look at our intimacy, we look at our lives, we look at our calendars, and we just try to be transparent about, what's up for the next 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 6 months. Where are we stretched each other? Where are we stressed with each other? And being transparent enough to say, this is where I'm at with it. Sometimes I go to that meeting like I did anything else, my butt cheeks real tight, not really looking forward to the meeting at all. But there's never been a time when I didn't walk away from that meeting going, I'm glad I had that meeting. Because I'm clean with my wife, everything's, we're talking about stuff. I'm not controlling all the money and just giving her little tidbits of information. She knows exactly what's going on. She handles the household budget. I do most of all the investments and things. But that all comes together in transparency. And it really helps with this unmanageability. Because left to my own devices, I'll just start controlling things and doing my own thing like I always did my whole life. By default. I don't need any help to do that. It just happens. But a week of that, a month of that, 6 months of that, a year of that, it really puts the strain on your relationships. And then the pain of that, emotional, mental anguish that comes from that, you start looking for relief, in other spaces and other places. And so that's the challenge. So that's heavy stuff to kick off our time together, but it's just something I would challenge you with. It's just where's unmanageability showing up in your life, it isn't the practical outskirts things. It's my emotions, it's my ego, it's the pride, it's the fear. Where is it showing up? It's not if it's there. I already know it's there, but where is it? Am I even in touch with it? Where that's at. And I know the more I'm in touch with that, the more I'm transparent about that, the better my life is. And even all that said, I still want to look a little cleaner than I am. And I still very good at fabricating, very good at it, master's degree, doctorate degree, and that kind of stuff of what's going on in my life. And I've been doing it long before I ever took a drink. How you doing, kid? I'm fine. I'm good. Might not even say anything. Might just be a head nod, body language, the Heisman, whatever, to keep you at bay. But we're just not talking about me. The walls are up. And I'm a master at that. A master with words. Wordsmith when it comes to deflection. So that's what I'll kick us off with our old ideas, where that's at in my life, a little bit of what that looks like. We'll talk a whole lot more about that as time goes on. But with that, Johnny, I'm going to pass it over to you, brother.
Thanks. I'm John, I'm alcoholic.
Hey, John.
I appreciated the way you started us off, Harold, and making us reflect that way. That's important for me. As I was going to speak for both of us, but as I share with you this weekend, and I think Harold says the same, is that it's not from a position of, oh, well, this is how things used to be, and now we're on the other side, and everything's perfect, right? Like, this is still an everyday part of my life, at least. My ego likes to tell me that my job here this weekend is to be an expert, and they send this weekend's tape to the AA Hall of Fame, and that's not my job this weekend. My job is to share with you part of my life, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and that's what I hope to do. This idea of unmanageability and old ideas has been rampant, in my life. The old ideas are so devastating. What we believe and what we don't believe is everything, whether it's just about ourselves or about God or the solution. I didn't know for a long time that the Big Book does not promise that manageability will ever be returned. It does promise that sanity will return, but nowhere does it say, okay, you've now learned to manage your life. Here's the keys back. You can go drive down the street with it. And we learn to manage our life with the spiritual principles and a relationship with God. That's different. But unmanageability can still be in my life, especially with finances. I am just I'm like a kid at the candy store with financial things. I mean, I call it boat porn. I can spend all day long on a website building a boat I can't afford and convincing myself how I'm going to buy this boat and how this boat's going to change my life. And Just recently, Harold had to counsel me into getting rid of a boat. My wife and I, we spent the first 50 years of my life in Maryland, and we moved down here, down here. We moved to Nashville 3 years ago, and we had sold our house, and Nashville had this really big economic boom, and you had all of like 24 hours to decide if you wanted to buy a house or it was gone. And so we bought a house. I'll tell you, we bought a house that was a little bit out of our, at the top level of what we wanted to spend. And I remember Renee saying to me, can we afford this house? Cause she's not really interested in finance. I'm just telling you the truth. She's not really interested in finances. She wants to know when she goes to the store, the car is going to work. That's all she cares. And that might be a little bit unfair, but that's been her description to some degree. So, can we afford this house? And it's on the, as long as we don't take on any more debt and buy anything we shouldn't buy, we can afford this house. Well, I'm not in that house 6 months, and, I spend a day on the Vexus Bass Boat website, and, I'm down the drain $100,000 and, borrowed it, of course, and then we, spent a little bit too much money on furnishing the house, and before you know it, right, your budget doesn't work, and it's these old ideas that somehow, some way, the answer is out there, that my life, and I've been around a long time, been through a lot of spiritual ups and downs, I know enough, I know to the core of my soul that I'm not going to be satisfied with a bass boat. I know that. I'm sober a long time. I get that. It's not going to fix me. I get that. But it really might make my life a little bit better. You know what I mean? But I want to step back a little bit to my early recovery. As I shared with you last night, I'm a young guy in sobriety. And where I got sober, there was not this, excuse me, it's going to be a long weekend. There was not this institutionalized kind of religious methodology of going through the book, that a lot of that we have today. Joe and Charlie's Big Book Adventure had not been to our area. You know what I mean? Where I got sober in this AA club, it was don't drink, go to meetings, and try to help somebody. And they were talking about the steps to some degree, but man, we never cracked a big book in this AA club. I mean, we just didn't. I'm not blaming anybody. That's just the way it was. And until some of the pain came and started finding some different meetings, but unmanageability and self-will and riot was my battle cry. It was, if only this, if only that. My life would be okay if I got hurt. My life would be okay if I got this. If I can save up this, life will be okay. And I really missed the second half of the first step, And I see it so much. I go to a treatment center Monday nights, and I go to a prison Monday nights. I alternate them. And so many guys, I hope you're involved in the treatment centers, so many guys, you see them, they finally accept that truth. Okay, I get it. I can no longer drink. I can no longer get high. I get that. I got it. Like this new knowledge I have was the problem. Before we got to treatment, the problem was this old idea that somehow, someday I could manage safely. Obviously, had to be smashed. And as soon as that was, it's like, oh, okay, I get it now. I can't. That's the problem. And this idea of unmanageability just escaped me. It was, I didn't even know what that meant when I got here. My sponsor briefly told me, he's like, you have to report to the state every month for a drug test, right? And I was like, yeah. He's like, well, yeah, the state has to manage your life. I was like, okay, so I got that. And we didn't dive into the book and really understood what that meant, and I had a second surrender with a lot of years of sobriety. I went back through the book with a newfound love and passion, and as a result of that, I now take guys through the first step differently. At the beginning of We Agnostics, it says in the preceding chapters, we hope we've made the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. So that's the purpose of those first 3 chapters plus the doctor's opinion. And what my sponsor asked me to do, and what I ask guys to do is, go through those 4 chapters by yourself. And if you can't read, we'll do it together. But go through those chapters and find yourself in there, because it's a really personal question. It doesn't matter what my mom thinks or the judge thinks or my employer thinks. This idea that I'm powerless over alcohol, my life is unmanageable, is a very personal one. And as a result of that, what happens is when I do that and I underline or circle or use crayon to find myself in there, and I've got, I guess that's like 60 pages, and I've got something circled on 58 out of 60 pages, something subconsciously happens into me that I'm in the right place, that I need something more than just not drinking and not using drugs, that I need this spiritual solution, which I didn't have for a long time. As I mentioned last night, it was nearly impossible to convince me that lack of power is my dilemma. 2 weeks ago during Nashville, about 300,000 of us, lack of power was our dilemma. This little group text, and we would tease each other, guys would be complaining about their power still being out. Oh, lack of power is your dilemma. I just thought when I got here I had to make my life look a certain way. And I took that woman hostage, and we got married, and we got divorced in less than a year. Got with Renee, and Renee and I met in this AA club. She came in crazy as a bedbug. Bless you. She took the room hostage and threw up all over it, and I was like, man, that's the woman for me. And she was smoking hot. I got to have this woman, and there was a couple issues with that. She was married, and I was engaged. But God figured all that out. I say that kind of jokingly, and this is kind of ironic. Her husband was in my first wedding as an usher, and but then we kind of spread. They moved to a little different part of town, and we moved. We didn't really see each other. And then she got divorced, and my wife and I were getting split up, and our sponsors were married, and after that first divorce, it caused me to dive back into the steps with a different passion. Because there I was again. I didn't care that she was leaving. I was gone. I was so glad that she left. I didn't want to be married. I had no idea what marriage was being about. I just thought it meant, more regular sex. That is not what it means. Temporarily it does. But, as I told you, I'd gotten kicked out of the Navy. Came home the loser's loser, and then I took her hostage, and then she rolls out, and I get fired from this job. Just everything, still completely unmanageable, and I'm just devastated that I fail at one more thing. And Charles did his best to take me through the steps, but he wasn't a big book guy. And a number of years later, I had another huge kind of second surrender, and I'm going to talk a lot about that in 6 and 7. But what I want to tell you about that second surrender right now is I'm 18 years sober, almost 19 years sober. I've ruined every aspect of my life. Every area of my life was a train wreck. This business that I had bought got repossessed from the stockholders. The IRS had garnished my checking account 3 times and taken what was little in there. My cars were repossessed. My house was in foreclosures. And I traded in the thing that I valued most about my life. I used to say all the time in meetings, man, I've done a lot wrong in sobriety, but I've never picked up. I've never been unfaithful to my wife, and I traded that in. And I got hooked up with a guy that loved our book. But as I said, 3 o'clock in the morning, 18 years sober, I'm laying on the kitchen floor crying like a schoolgirl. And the best thing I can come up with John in full management again, is rifle or shotgun. Which one's it going to be? I just can't stand the feeling of me. One more second. Here I am again. I've managed my life into the crapper. There's nothing salvageable about this. Full of self-pity. Look at my life. AA clearly doesn't work. I'm getting ready to pick up my 19-year chip, and AA clearly does not work. And I had the greatest moment of clarity I've ever had in my life, and it sounded like my first sponsor in the back of my head, and he said, "Dummy, like, you're not doing AA. I'd gotten off the AA path." And I said the greatest prayer I've ever said in my life, I think, most sincere prayer I've ever said in my life. And that was, "God, fix me or kill me. Just do one of them quick," you know. And it's a long way of telling you, coming back to this idea of old ideas. So I'd gotten hooked up with this guy that loved our big book. And I called him up. I'd heard this 4-step talk that he gave, and I said, "Man, I think that's the missing piece." Because I was desperately trying to figure out, how does a guy screw up his life so bad, stone cold sober? I mean, it just seemed like there was nothing in my life that I managed. I mean, I'm telling you, I'm not being dramatic, there was nothing that I managed well in my life. How does that happen? And my wife and I decided to try to work the marriage out. We had a bunch of young kids. Many years before, she kept getting pregnant every 9 months and 5 minutes, and so we had all these kids running around. We didn't want our kids to. You understand that? We wanted to have a family unit, and we went to therapists and all these different. I read a zillion books. Basically, what's wrong with John? And what makes somebody screw up their life so bad with everything seemingly going so well? And so I'd heard Scott give this 4-step talk, and it blew my mind. Like, I'd done a couple 4 steps, but there was a lot of work in there that, in the black part that I hadn't done. And so I called him up, and I'd never met Scott. I'd gotten his phone number from the internet, the white pages or whatever it's called. And I'd called him up, and I said, "Hey, man, every day I'm thinking about killing myself. I'd had this great surrender that I just told you about. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I had this great surrender that I'll do whatever it takes, but that didn't change my life. Surrender by itself doesn't get you anywhere without action." And I called him up, and I said, "Hey, man, you don't know me, but I heard this talk you gave, and I'm dying inside. If you don't do the 4-step with me, I'm not going to make it to my next anniversary. Every day I'm thinking about killing myself." And this is what he said. He said, I don't know about the God of your understanding, but I just got off my knees this morning, and I asked God to send me somebody to help, and I guess you're it." Now, I didn't know he said that prayer every morning, but, that was my day, So that's a long way of me telling you this, that he said, "But I'm not going to do the 4-step with you." I was like, "Man, what are you talking about, dude? I just told you the problem. I told you the solution. Let's get to it." A little bit of willingness had left, as you can see. And he said, "Man, let's go through the whole book together. Let's just follow the instructions in there." And I said, "All right, I'll do whatever you tell me to do." He said, "Man, I don't need you to do whatever you tell me to do. Let's just do the book together." And in doing that, it's a big circle for me to get to this. In doing that, I had this crazy, out-of-this-world experience with we agnostics. I did not know this, but for 18 years of my life, I had completely ignored we agnostics. It might as well have been to the wives. Right? Because if we're in a meeting together and we're reading, if somehow I'm in a big book meeting and we're reading, I'll read it with you, but it's obligatory. I'm not a seeker. That's why I love these weekends, is most of the time, unless you got drug here or forced here by your sponsor, weekends like this are the seekers, and my people. So, if I was in a meeting, I would pretend to read it or something, I almost thought the title of it was Chapter to the Agnostic. Like, hey, if you're an agnostic, read this. And I thought, well, I believe in God, so I really don't, in hindsight, so I really don't need this chapter. That's for those people, like to the wives. And but I promised this old crusty dude I would read the book and do what it says. And what I found out, and what I come to believe, is that we are all agnostics when we get here. Even those of the fullest, strongest faith, we are all agnostics when we get here. And I'm going to tell you why. A Gnostic, not with the A, just a Gnostic, Gnostic. A Gnostic is somebody with working, experiential relationship knowledge of. It's not 1 + 1 = 2 knowledge. It's, hey, I've been in the trenches and I have this working knowledge, right? Like the difference of somebody going to law school and having the knowledge versus doing 10 years of murder trials. There's a different degree of knowledge, right? And the reason why I think we're all agnostic when we get here, because if we had a working, experiential relationship with God, we would have tapped into that and gone the other way before we wound up in Alcoholics Anonymous. Right? Alcoholics Anonymous is not the first stop, right? It's the last stop. And we've all tried many things before we come to AA. And the whole, for me, my sponsor has trained me to look for themes in the chapters and in the book and chase those themes, the message that Bill's trying to convey in that particular part of the work. And 7 times in We Agnostics, Bill uses the word prejudiced. And that means old ideas. We have to get rid of these old ideas. In the first step, I've admitted I'm powerless. Really quickly in We Agnostics, after you've answered this, it says in the preceding chapters, we've made the distinction between the two, and then it really defines alcoholism. If when you honestly want to, you find you can't quit entirely, or if when drinking you can't control the amount you take, you're probably an alcoholic. And then it goes on to talk about only a spiritual experience is going to be able to help you conquer this. And the next page, 7 times in a couple of paragraphs, it tells you that lack of power is your dilemma. But the problem is, for me, for many years in my sobriety, was my old ideas about God. I'm putting AA batteries into a AAA battery remote, and it's just not working. But early in sobriety, I thought, my first time, a couple times through the steps with the sponsor, when we talk about the second step, do you believe? Yeah, I believe. I believe in God. Let's go. Next, on to the third step. And didn't really do any examination about what I believed. But that whole chapter is dedicated to 2 things. One is examining what you believe. Because in the third step, which we're going to talk about in a lot greater depth in the next session, in the third step, I'm going to be asked to put all my chips in the middle of the table. All of them. I don't get to hold back any. And I'm not going to do that with a God that's keeping score. I'm not going to do that with a God that's angry at me. I'm not going to do that with a God that's not interested in me. I'm not going to do that with a God that's merit-based. I had all these old ideas that were blocking me from this power. If I think God's mad at me, there's no way I can tap into that power. But I was for certain he was, because my 1,000,001 promises that Harold talked about last night, God, get me out of this and I'll never do it again. Right? All those lies and broken promises and deals with God that didn't come true. And so those were some of the big ideas, but the biggest one was that God's love and mercy and this feeling of forgiveness was merit-based. And the second big theme throughout that chapter is, so what's interesting about Alcoholics Anonymous in that chapter is, while it asks us to really examine what we believe, it doesn't demand that we believe anything. I want to make that clear, especially for our new friends here, right? AA does not care what you believe, but you have to believe in something. Why? Because you're powerless. Lack of power is your dilemma. So you have to find a power. Right? All the great religions, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Mother Earthism, whatever you got ism, they all have one thing in common. Do you know what it is? They send their drunks to Alcoholics Anonymous, right? We just don't care what you believe in, right? It's not a faith-based question. It's a conception question. What is your conception of this God idea? And that's the second big theme throughout We Agnostics, is that we get to come up with this with our own conception. That idea is in Bill's story, right? Many people have talked about that That's the thing that really separated us out from the Oxford group. We all know the story, right? I think it's page 9. Ebby shows up on Bill's door, looking good, white shirt, good-looking haircut. It's clearly hasn't had a drink in a couple days. And Bill says to him, what's gotten into you, my old friend? He says, I got religion. And the next thing that Bill says is, I was aghast. Now, I'm not a very well-educated man, so I had to look that word up. What aghast means is he threw up in his mouth a little bit. Right? Because Bill had been down that road. And then, a page later, Ebby drops the bomb on him that changes us from being a religious type Oxford group movement. And all frustration, he says, man, just choose your own conception, Bill. And later on in working with others, it talks about choosing your own conception. All throughout We Agnostics, choose your own conception. So and the wording of this was really monumental for me. It might not be for you. But what my sponsor asked me to do was come up with my own conception. Not what I believe God is today, but even though what I believe is very important, I heard something the other day, I was dumbfounded. What was the guy's name? Roger Bannister, who broke the first guy to break the 4-minute mile. It had been 100 years of people timing themselves, running laps and stuff. I think the stopwatch was invented in like 1850. And he didn't break the 4-minute, he was the first guy to break the 4-minute mile in, I think, 1954. So 100 years, nobody has done this. Roger Bannister breaks the 4-minute mile. In the next year, 16 guys do it, right? Because it now became possible. And there was no longer this thing, well, the human body can't do this, right? They believed it was possible. So my sponsor asked me to jot down some one-word characteristics, concepts of what I needed God to be if I'm going to go on with the rest of the steps. Not what I believe he is today, but what I want him, need him to be if I'm really going to turn my will and my life over to God. And every time I've done that with a guy, I've done that with many guys, many workshop forums all over the place, and they're pretty much the same. I need a God that's all loving, loves everybody. The guy on death row that killed 17 people, as much as the greatest saints. I need a God that's all powerful, a God that can fix even the messes that I make. I mean, I make some messes. And then I needed a God that had a sense of humor. I needed a God that wanted me to be happy, joyous, and free, to be at peace. But this last one, I said, I need a God that's forgiving. And he said, yeah, I get that. I do too. But this verbiage really changed it for me, and it's changed again for me. But he said, how about a God that's eager to forgive you? And I was like, oh, that's a big difference than just willing to forgive if I do A, B, and C. If I'm a good boy long enough, then I get forgiveness, right? Back to that old idea of merit-based forgiveness. Because I get caught up in doing something I shouldn't be doing, and I'd bring that to God and, really want God's forgiveness for this sin of the month, right? And I feel like if I don't do it for a certain period of time, then forgiveness comes, right? I mean, I was not born in a very religious household. We didn't go to church unless someone was married or buried. So I didn't have any, conception really forced down my throat. Every conception I had about God came from the 1980s sitcom television series and whatever my friends had told me about God, right? I had no real authoritative figure telling me anything about God, but I just had associated this idea that God will love me if I'm a good boy, kind of like Santa Claus. And so he's like, how about a God that's eager to forgive? And he said, what we're going to do is we're just going to go on with the rest of the steps. And if these things are true, it's going to build a relationship, right? Which is a lot different than a belief system. I needed to start developing this relationship with this God of my understanding or misunderstanding. And look, this is not about figuring God out. I want to be clear about that, right? The book clearly says we can never fully comprehend or understand that was God. But even Shoemaker, one of AA's best early friends, from the Calvary Mission in New York in the early days, and had a big role in bringing AA to Maryland, where I'm from, so Shoemaker's a big name. Shoemaker said that we have a tough time turning our will and our life over to the care of God if we don't have any idea who He is. It's kind of like, and I tell my new guys who I'm taking through this part of the work, I say, listen, it's like when you start dating your first girl in sobriety, you hope she's going to be honest and trustworthy, and that she's got your back, and she's got these certain characteristics. Now, you don't know if she does, but you're just going to hope she does. You're going to act as if she is, and you're going to go through your life, and you're going to keep your eyes open. And if she is these things, it's going to build a relationship, it's going to build a bond. And that's the same thing that we're going to do in here. We're going to go through the rest of the steps and see if God is all loving, all powerful, all merciful, and that will grow that relationship. Take us from an agnostic to a Gnostic. And I'm here to tell you that, and that was almost 20 years ago, and even in that time, my concept continues to change. My faith continues to change, and I hope yours does too, right? My relationship with God is the most important thing in my life today. And I challenge you that same question. What is the most important thing in your life? And so if it is your relationship with God, this power, like what you believe or what you think or what your concept is vitally important. But what's changed for me in years past is this idea of, and Harold went out there and had the blessing of meeting Father Greg, one of my heroes, one of my favorite authors. Father Greg Boyle put this idea in my head that this concept of God that I really like. He says, that I don't know that God's ever been mad at me long enough to ever really need to forgive me. Our friend Bob says often that we believe God makes us in His image and His likeness, and yet we make the mistake of returning the favor, which means we assign these humanly qualities back to God for no reason, just because that's what we do. And I get what we're saying. Like that's a human feeling. I want to feel forgiven. I've offended you. I want you to be merciful. I want you to not hold that against me and give me a second chance. But I love that idea that God's never been mad at me long enough to need to forgive me. That the love meter has never been off of 100. Every time I've turned back to that power, it's always been there. It has never been conditional, right? But the requirement for me for that has been to put down the self, and then I get to see that power. When I'm lost in self and unmanageability, I don't get to access that power. So as we go through this journey together this weekend, I ask you to examine that. What's the most important thing in your life today? And the crazy thing is, I can tell you, 36 years sitting here, 36 years sober, I believe that with all my being. I can pass a lie detector test. That's the most important thing in my life. But why don't I always act that way? So we're going to take a 15-minute break, and we're going to come back here at 10:15, I think that says. So thank you guys, and we'll see you in 15 minutes.